Hello, hello, hello everyone. Happy night of All Hallows Eve to you in the States. It seems that I am now live, that is good. Tonight, for those of you who are able to listen, we have a couple of treats. Maybe a few tricks. Tonight's stories include The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson, Dracula's Guest by the one and only Bram Stoker, my apologies. As well as a few short stories, very short stories, from the lovely website, thescoopwhoop.com, with short scary stories. Most of it, I believe, is from Reddit. But these stories include This New Old House by Bat Out of Hell 821. I Hate It When My Brother Charlie Has to Go Away by Horror in Pure Form. Guardians by Dark Alligator. Seeing Red, The First Day of School by Zinre Hao. My Daughter Learned to Count by Real Science 87. And There's No Reason to Be Afraid by Whoever Fights Monster. So, needless to say, grab your delicious candy. Oh, happy Halloween, Mick. Pardon, it's a little hard for me to read currently. Can't really see without my glasses. Mick plays Fleshy Child, Edgy, and oh, look at that, it's Papyrus. Ah, we would, but sadly Toby has put in a special little thing that says we cannot play it currently. We must wait 24 hours before we can do a gameplay of it, as per Toby's request. But you are more than welcome to play. Tonight's story, The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlour of the George at Debenham, the undertaker, the landlord, Fitz, and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow, frost, we 4 would be each planted in his own particular armchair. Fitz was an old drunken Scotchman, a man of education obviously, and a man of some property, since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham years ago, while still young, and by mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue cabinet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlour at the George, his absence from church, his old crapulous, disrespectable vices, were all things of course in Debenham. He had some vague radical opinions, and some fleeting infidelities, which he would now and again set forth and emphasize with tottering slaps upon the table. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George sat, with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We call him the Doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation, but beyond these slight particulars we had no knowledge of his character and antecedents. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us. There was a sick man in the George. A great neighbouring proprietor suddenly struck down with an apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Debenham, for the railway was but newly open, and we were all proportionately moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he had filled and lighted his pipe. "He," said I. "Who? Not the doctor." "Himself," replied our host. "What is his name?" "Dr. MacFarlane," said the landlord. Fitz was far through his third tumbler, stupidly bundled, now nodding over, now staring mazily around him. By the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeat the name MacFarlane twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion the second. "Yes," said the landlord, "that's his doctor, Dr. Wolfe MacFarlane." Fitz became instantly sober. His eyes awoke, his voice became clear, loud, and steady, his language forcible and earnest. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I'm afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe MacFarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, "It cannot be. It simply cannot be," he added. "And yet I would like well to see him face to face." "Do you know him, doctor?" asked the undertaker with a gasp. "Oh, God forbid," was the reply, "and yet the name is a strange one. It were too much to fancy to. Tell me, landlord, is he old?" "Well," said the host, "he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair is white, but he looks younger than you. He is older, though, years older, but," with a slap upon the table, "it's the rum you see in my face, rum and sin. This man perhaps may have an easy conscience and a good digestion. Conscience, hear me speak. You would think I was some good old decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted if he'd stood in my shoes, but the brains," with a rattling fillip of his bald head, "the brains were clear and active, and I saw and made no deductions." "I know, if you know this doctor," I ventured to remark, after a somewhat awful pause, "I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion." Fitz paid no regard to me. "Yes," he said with sudden decision, "I must see him face to face." There was another pause. Then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. "That's the doctor," cried the landlord. "Look sharp, and you can catch him." It was but 2 steps from the small parlour to the door of the Old George Inn. The wide oak staircase landed almost in the street. There was room for a Turkey rug, and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent. And this little space was every evening brilliantly lit up, not only by the light upon the stair, and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street. Fitz walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the two men meet, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. MacFarlane was alert and vigorous. His white hair set off his pale and placid, although energetic countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest of broadcloth, and the whitest of linen, with a great gold watch chain, and studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There is no doubt but he became his years, breathing as he did of wealth and consideration. Pardon 1 moment. Just lost my place. Lost it. Where'd my glasses go? There they are. He wore a broad folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving fur coat. There was no doubt but he became his years, breathing as he did of worth and consideration, and it was a surprising contrast to see our parlour sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his old camlet cloak, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. "MacFarlane," he said somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short on the full step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. "Toddy McFarlane," repeats Fitz. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of scare, then in a whispered voice startled out. "Fitz," he said. "You!" "Aye," said the man. "Me. Did you think I was dead too? We are not so easy to shut of our acquaintance." "Hush!" exclaimed the doctor. "Hush! This meeting is so unexpected I can see you are unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess at first, but I am overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present it must be howdy-do and goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train. But you shall, let me see, yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fitz. I fear you are out at elbows, and we must see to that for Auld Lang Syne, as once we sang at suppers. Money, cried Fitz, money from you. The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it in the rain." Dr. McFarlane had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost venerable countenance. "My dear fellow," he said, "be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address, however. I do not wish it. I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you," interrupted the other. "I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wish to know if, after all, there were a God. I know now that there is none. Begone." He still stood in the middle of the rug, between the stair and the doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before the thought of this humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles, but while he was still paused and uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlour, huddled by the corner of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent striking for the door. But his tribulation was not yet entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fitz clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper, yet painfully distinct. "Have you seen it again?" The great rich London doctor cried out aloud with a sharp throttling cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space, and with his hands over his head fled out the door like a detected thief. Before it had occurred to one of us to make a move, the fly was already rattling toward the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had little proofs and traces of its passage. Next day the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the bar-room window, and Fitz at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. "God protect us, Mr. Fitz," said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. "What in the universe is all this? These are strange things you have been saying." Fitz turned towards us. He looked us each in succession in the face. "See if you can hold your tongues," he said. "That man McFarlane is not safe to cross. Those that have done so already have repented it too late." And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us good-bye and went forth under the lamp of the hotel into the black, black night. We three turned to our places in the parlour with the big red fire and the 4 clear candles, and we recapitulated what had just passed. The first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have known in this old George. Each man before we parted had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion, and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It is no great boast, but I believe I was a better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the old George. And perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul, unnatural events. In his young days, Fitz studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears, and readily retails it for its own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favoured, and pleased by his exterior. There was at that period a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall hereby designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution at Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K was then at the top of his vogue. He enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fitz believed him, and was believed by others to have laid the foundations of success when he had acquired the favour of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K was a bon vivant, as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly illusion, no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities Fitz enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or subsistence in his class. In this capacity the charge of the theatre and lecture room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of other students, and it was part of his duty to serve, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K in the same wind, and at last in the same building, with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his head still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawned by the unclean and desperate interlopers who studied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous through the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone, while they were gone, with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuses of the night and refresh himself for the labours of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed among the incense of morality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of another, the slave of his own desires and low ambition. Cold, light, and selfish in the last resort, he had that modicum of prudence, miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted bedsides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered impeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by the nights of roaring blackguardly enjoyments, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In the large and busy class, the raw material of an anatomist kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K to ask no questions in his dealing with the trade. They bring me the body, we pay the price. He used to say, dwelling on the alliteration, quid pro quo, and again, somewhat profanely, ask no questions. He would tell his assistants for conscience sake. There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror, but the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was in itself the offence against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Vets, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hangdog abominable look of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast, or thrown himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen at last into that profound uneasy slumber that often follows on a night of pain, when he was awakened by the third and fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy, and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable air already polluted the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Vets, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned dozing with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find them in the money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer with the candle raised. "God Almighty," he said, "that is Jane Galbraith." The man answered nothing, and they shuffled nearer the door. I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other looked Fitz darkly in the eyes and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuse, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery that he had made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions, and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe McFarlane, a high favourite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had travelled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skilful on the ice, or the links with a skate or a golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and strong trotting horse. With Fetz he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in McFarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lowly graveyard, and return before anyone noticed they were gone. On that particular morning, McFarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fetz heard him, met him on the stairs, told him the story, and showed the cause of his alarm. McFarlane examined the marks of her body. "Yes," he said with a nod, "it looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fitz. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything? Least said, soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognize her," objected Fitz. "She was as well known as Castle Rock." "We'll hope not," said McFarlane. "And if anyone does, well, you didn't, don't you see? And there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud and you'll get Kay into the most unholy trouble, and you'll be in a shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any one of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that, practically speaking, all our subjects have been murdered." "McFarlane!" cried Fitz. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself. Suspecting is one thing, and proof another. Yes, I know. I am as sorry as you are that I should have come here," tapping the body with his cane. "The next best thing for me is not to recognize it. And," he added coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate. But I think a man of the world would do as I do, and I may add, I fancy that is what Mr. K would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives." This is the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fitz. He agreed to imitate McFarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected. No one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fitz dropped into a popular tavern and found McFarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, which was but feebly realized in his manners, for he proved upon a nearer acquaintance coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over McFarlane, issued orders like the great Bashaw, and became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the servility with which he was obeyed. The most offensive person took a fancy to Fitz on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honoured him with unusual confidences on his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. "I'm a pretty bad fellow myself," the stranger remarked, "but McFarlane is the boy. Toddy McFarlane, I call him. Toddy, order your friends another glass. Or it might be Toddy. You jump up and shut the door. Toddy hates me," he said again. "Oh, yes, Toddy, you do." "Don't you call me that confounded name," growled McFarlane. "You hear him? Did you ever see the lads play knife? He would like to do that all over my body," remarked the stranger. "We medicals have a better way than that," said Fitz. "When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him." McFarlane looked up sharply, as though this jest was scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fitz to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown into commotion, and when all was done, commanded McFarlane to settle the bill. It was late before they separated. The man Gray was incapably drunk. McFarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander, and the slights he had been obliged to swallow. Fitz was with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. Next day McFarlane was absent from class, and Fitz smiled to himself as he imagined him still squiring the indulgable Gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them, however, nowhere, so returned early to his rooms, went early to bed, and slept the sleep of the just. At 4 in the morning he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find McFarlane with his gig, and in the gig one of those long, ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" But McFarlane silenced him roughly, bidding him return to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, McFarlane made at first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate. And then, "You had better look at the face," said he, in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated, as Fitz only stared at him in wonder. "And where and how and when did you come by it?" said the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fitz was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body, then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was cruel, to see fixed in the rigidity of death, and naked on all that coarse layer of sackcloth, the man whom he had left well clad and full of meat and sin upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke even in the thoughtless vets some of the terrors of the conscience. It was a crass tibby which re-echoed in his soul, that to whom he had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolf. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was McFarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind, and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulder. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now Richardson was a student, had long been anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Fetz found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for what?" "Pay you for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means, and on every possible account you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Galbraith's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if all were right. Where does old K keep his money?" "There," answered Fetz hoarsely, pointing to the cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key, then," the other calmly holding out his hand. There was an instant hesitation, and the die was cast. McFarlane could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief, as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, and brought out a pen and ink, took the paper, and stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in the drawer some suitable for the occasion. "Now look here," he said, "there is the payment made, first proof of your good faith, first step into your security. You have now to clinch it by a second. Enter the payment in your book, and then you for your part may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fetz an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with McFarlane. He set down the candle which she had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. "And now," said McFarlane, "it's only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. By the by, when a man of the world falls into a bit of luck, has a few shillings extra in his pocket, I'm ashamed to speak of it, but there's a rule of conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squandering of old debts. Borrow, don't lend." "McFarlane," began Fetz, somewhat hoarsely, "I have put my neck in a halter to oblige you." "To oblige me?" cried Wolf. "Oh, come, you did as near as I can see the matter what you downright had to do in self-defence. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be?" "This second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Gray's the continuation of Miss Galbraith. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning. That's the truth. No rest for the wicked." A horrible sense of blackness and treachery of fate seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. "My God!" he cried. "What have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant, in the name of reason, where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position. Service might have got it. Would he have been where I am now? My dear fellow, what a boy you are," McFarlane said. "What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Why, man, you do know what this life is. There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Gray or Jane Galbraith. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You're staggered at the first. But look at Kay, my dear fellow. You're clever. You have pluck. I like you. Kay likes you. You were born to lead the hunt, and I tell you on my honour and my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce." And with that, McFarlane took his departure and drove up off to the wind in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fitz was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril in which he stood involved. He saw the inexpressible dismay, that there was no limit to his weakness, and that from concession to concession he had fallen from the arbiter of McFarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the world to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Galbraith and the cursed entry of that daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Grey were dealt out to one and to another, and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of freedom rang, Fetz trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone towards safety. For 2 days he continued to watch with increasing joy the dreadful process of disguise. On the 3rd day McFarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he made up for lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson in particular he extended the most valuable assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of the demonstrator, burnt high with the ambitious hopes, and saw the medal already in his grasp. Before the week was out, McFarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fitz had outlived his doubters and had forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage, and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back on these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplice he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and McFarlane was from first to last particularly kind and jovial. But it was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fitz whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into closer union. Mr. K. was again short of subjects, pupils were eager, and it was part of the teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time there came the news of a burial in the rustic graveyard at Glencorse. Time has little changed the place in question. It stood then as now, upon a crossroad, out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighbouring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among pebbles, the other dripping furtively from pond to pond, the stir of the wind in mountainous old flowering chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of a precentor were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the ruled church. The resurrection man, the use of a byname of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, the paths worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and inscriptions of bereaved affection. To rustic neighbourhoods, where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood and fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body-snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been laid to earth in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty, lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cements torn, and the melancholy relics, clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as 2 vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fitz and McFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years, and had been known for nothing but good butter and a godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried, dead and naked, to that faraway city that she had always honoured with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty to the crack of doom, her innocent and almost venerable members to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon the pair set forth, still wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of wind, but those sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Pennacook, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not too far from the churchyard, and once again, on the fish's driest, to have the toast before the kitchen fire, and vary their nips of whisky with a glass of ale. Pardon. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comfortable, and the two young doctors in a private room sat to the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights of the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold incongruous work that lay before them added zest to the environment of the meal. With every glass their cordiality increased. Soon MacFarlane handed a pile of gold to his companion. A compliment, he said, between friends these little accommodations ought to fly, like pipe lights. Betts pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment to the echo. "You are a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass till I knew you. You and Kay, between you, by the Lord Harry, but you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded MacFarlane. "A man, I tell you. I required a man to back me up the other morning. There were some big, brawling 40-year-old cowards who would have done sick at the look of the deedy thing. And not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fitz thus daunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" And he slapped his pocket till the gold pieces rang. MacFarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted what he had been taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued in the boastful strain. "The great thing is not to be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang, that's practical, but for all cats, MacFarlane, I was born with a contempt. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and all the old gallery of curiosities. They may frighten boys, but men of the world like you and me despise them. Here's to the memory of Grey." It was by this time growing somewhat late. The gig, according to order, was brought round to the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take to the road. They announced that they were bound for Peebles, and drove in their direction until they were clear of the last houses of the town, then extinguished the lamps, returned upon their course, and followed a by-road towards Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage and the insistent strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch black. Here and there a white gate or a white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night, but for the most part it was a foot pace, and almost groping, that they would pick their way through the resonant blackness of their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighbourhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessary to kindle a match and re-illuminate one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the draping trees and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labours. They were both experienced by such affairs, powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been between 20 minutes on their task before they were rewarded by a dull rattle of the coffin lid. At the same moment, MacFarlane, having hurt his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave, in which they now stood almost to the shoulders, was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped, the better to illuminate their labours, against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken a sure aim with the stone. Then came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds alternately dull and ringing announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank, and its occasional collision bent their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain now, marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of open country. They were so nearly at the end of their abhorred task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack, and carried between them to the gig. One mounted to keep it in place, and the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along by the wall and bush until they reached the wider road of the Fisher's Tryst. Here was a faint diffused radiancy, which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed the horse to a good pace, and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of town. They had been both wetted to the skin during the operations, and now as the gig jumped among the deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell upon one and now the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact seemed each instinctively repelled it with greater haste, and the process, natural although it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companion. MacFarlane made some ill-favoured jest about the farmer's wife, but it came hollowly from his lips, and was allowed to drop in silence. Still their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid as if in confidence upon the shoulders, and now the drenching of sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Fetz. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs accompanied the passage with the tragic ululations. And it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sake," said he, making a great effort to arrive at speech, "for God's sake, let's have a light." Seemingly MacFarlane was unaffected in the same direction, for though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down, and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no farther than the crossroad down to Achiclinney. The rain still poured as though the deluge was returning, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick, and began to expand and clarify and shed a wide circle of misty brightness round the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other, and the thing they had with them. The rain had moulded the rough sack to the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the truck, the shoulders plainly modelled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time MacFarlane stood motionless, holding up the lamp. A nameless dread was swathed like wet sheet about the body, and tightened the white skin upon the face of Fetz. A fear that was meaningless, a horror of what could not be, kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That is not a woman," said MacFarlane in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in," whispered Fetz. "Hold the lamp and the other. I must see her face." And as Fetz took to the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack, and drew down the cover of the head. The light fell very clear on the dark, well-moulded features and smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance, often beheld in dreams of both these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leapt from his own side into the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished. The horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded and went off toward Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing with it the sole occupants of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected Grey. And thus ends the tale by Robert Louis Stevenson. Forgive me as I must take a drink. The next one will be by Bram Stoker, Dracula's Ghost. And hello to you, Do. I do hope that you are enjoying the stories thus far. Oh, I am glad to hear that, Swap Papyrus. Now then, Dracula's Ghost by Bram Stoker. When we started our drive, the sun was shining brightly on Munich, and the air was full of the joyousness of early summer. Just as we were about to depart, Herr Dolbrick, the maitre d' of the hotel of the Quarter Saisons, where I was staying, came down bareheaded to the carriage, and after wishing me a pleasant drive, said to the coachman, still holding his hand on the handle of the carriage door, Remember, you are back by nightfall. The sky looks bright, but there is a shiver in the north wind that says there may be a storm, but I am sure you will not be late." Here he smiled and added, "For you know what night is." Johann answered with an emphatic "Ja, mein Herr," and touched his hat, drove off quickly. When he had cleared the town, I said, after signalling to him to stop, "Tell me, Johann, what is tonight?" He crossed himself as he answered laconically, "Walpurgisnacht." Then he took out his watch, a big, great, old-fashioned German silver thing, as big as a turnip, and looked at it, with his eyebrows gathered together and a little impatient shrug of his shoulders. I realized that this was his way of respectfully protesting against the unnecessary delay, and sank back in the carriage, merely motioning him to proceed. He started off rapidly, as if to make up for the lost time. Every now and then the horses seemed to throw up their heads and sniff the air suspiciously. On such occasions I often look around in alarm. The road was pretty bleak, for we were traversing a sort of high wind-swept plateau. As we drove, I saw a road that looked but little used, and which seemed to dip through a little winding alley. It looked so inviting that even at the risk of offending him, I called Johann to stop, and when he had pulled off, I told him I would like to drive down that road. He made all sorts of excuses, and frequently crossed himself as he spoke. This somewhat piqued my curiosity, so I asked him various questions. He answered fencingly, and repeatedly looked at his watch in protest. Finally I said, "Well, Johann, I want to go down this road. I shall not ask you to come unless you like, but tell me, why do you not like to go? That is all I ask." For answer he seemed to throw himself off the box, so quickly did that he reach the ground. Then he stretched out his hands appealingly to me, and implored me not to go. There was just enough of English mixed with the German for me to understand the drift of his talk. He seemed always just about to tell me something, the very idea of which evidently frightened him, but each time he pulled himself up, saying, "Walpurgisnacht." I tried to argue with him, but it was difficult to argue with a man when I did not know his language. The advantage certainly rested upon him, for although he began to speak in English of the very crude and broken kind, he always got excited and broke into his native tongue, and every time he did so he looked at his watch. Then the horses became restless and sniffed the air. At this he grew very pale, and looked around in a frightened way. He suddenly jumped forward, took them by the bridles, and led them on some 20 feet. I followed and asked why he had done this. For an answer he crossed himself and pointed to the spot we had left, and drew his carriage in the direction of the other road, indicating a cross, and said first German, then in English, "Buried him what killed themselves." I remember the old custom of burying suicides at crossroads. I see a suicide, how interesting, but for the life of me I could not make out why the horses were so frightened. Whilst we were talking, we heard a sort of sound between a yelp and a bark. It was far away, but the horses got very restless, and it took Johann all his time to quiet them. He was pale and said, "Sounds like wolf, but yet there are no wolves here now." "No," I said, questioning him. "Isn't it long since the wolves were so near the city?" "Long, long," he answered, "in the springtime and summer, but with the snow the wolves have been here not so long." Whilst he was petting the horses and trying to quiet them, dark clouds drifted rapidly across the sky. The sunshine passed away, and a breath of cold wind seemed to drift over us. It was only a breath, however, and more of a warning than a fact, for the sun came out brightly again. Johann looked under his lifted hand at the horizon and said, "The storm of snow, he comes before a long time." Then he looked at his watch again, and straightway, holding his reins firmly, for the horses were still pawing the ground restlessly, shaking their heads, he climbed to his box as though the time had come for proceeding on our journey. I felt a little obstinate, and did not at once get into the carriage. "Tell me," I said, "about this place where the road leads." I pointed direct down. Again he crossed himself, and mumbled a prayer before he answered, "It is unholy." "What is unholy?" I inquired. "The village." "Then there is a village?" No one lives there for hundreds of years." My curiosity was piqued. "But you said there was a village." "There was." "Where is it now?" Whereupon he burst out into a long story in German and English, so mixed up that I could not quite understand exactly what he said. Roughly, I gathered that long ago, hundreds of years, men had died there and been buried in their graves, but sounds were heard under the clay, and when the graves were opened, men and women were found rosy with life, their mouths red with blood. And so in haste to save their lives, aye, their souls, and here he crossed himself, those who were left fled away to another place, where the living lived and the dead were dead, and not something. He was evidently afraid to speak the last words. As he proceeded with his narration, he grew more and more excited. It seemed as if his imagination had got a hold of him, and he ended in a perfect paroxysm of fear, white-faced, perspiring, trembling, looking round him as if expecting that some dreadful presence would manifest itself there in the broad daylight of the open plain. Finally, in an agony of desperation, he cried, "Walpurgis Nacht," and pointed to the carriage for me to get in. All my English blood rose at this, and standing back, I said, "You are afraid, Johann. You are afraid. Go home. I shall return alone. The walk will do me some good." The carriage door was open. I took from the seat my oak walking stick, which I always carry on my holiday excursions, and closed the door, pointing back to Munich. And I said, "Go home, Johann. Walpurgis Nacht doesn't concern an Englishman." An Englishman. The horses were now more restive than ever, and Johann was trying to hold them in, while excitedly imploring me not to do anything so foolish. I pitied the poor fellow. He was so deeply in earnest, but all the same I could not help laughing. His English was quite gone now. In his anxiety he had forgotten that his only means of making me understand was to talk my language, so he jabbered away at me in his native German. It must have been a little tedious. After giving the direction home, I turned to go down the crossroad into the valley. With a despairing gesture, Johann turned his horses towards Munich. I leaned on my stick and looked after him. He went slowly away along the road for a while. Then there came over the crest of the hill a man, tall and thin. I could see so much in the distance. When he drew the crest of the hill, near the horses, they began to jump and kick about, then to scream with terror. Johann could not hold them in, and they bolted down the road, running away madly. I watched them out of sight, then looked for the stranger, but I found that he too was gone. With a light heart, I turned down the side road through the deepening valley, to which Johann had objected. There was not the slightest reason that I could see for his objection, and I dare say I tramped for a couple of hours without thinking of time or distance, and certainly without seeing a person or a house. So far as the place was concerned, it was desolation itself. But I did not notice this particularly till, on turning the bend in the road, I came upon a scattered fringe of wood. Then I recognized that I had been impressed unconsciously by the desolation of the region through which I had passed. I sat down to rest myself, and began to look around. It struck me that it was considerably colder than it had been at the commencement of my walk. A short sort of sighing sound seemed to be around me, with now and then, high overhead, a sort of muffled roar. Looking upwards, I noticed that the great thick clouds were drifting rapidly across the sky from north to south at great height. There were signs of a coming storm in some lofty stratum of the air. I was a little chilly, and thinking that it was the sitting still after the exercise of walking, I resumed my journey. The ground I passed over was now much more picturesque. There was no striking objects that the eye might single out, but in all there was a charm of beauty. I took little heed of time, and it was only when the deepening twilight forced itself upon me that I began to think of how I should find my way home. The air was cold, and the drifting of clouds high overhead was more marked. They were accompanied by a sort of far-away rushing sound, through which seemed to come at intervals that mysterious cry which the driver had said came from a wolf. For a while I hesitated. I had said I would see the deserted village, so on I went, and presently came on a wide stretch of open country, shut in by hills all around. I went, and presently came on a wide stretch. My apologies if you read it. The sides were covered with trees, which spread down to the plain, dotting in clumps the gentler slopes and hollows which showed here and there. I followed with my eye the winding of the road, and saw that it curved close to one of the densest of these clumps, and was lost behind it. As I looked, there came a cold shiver in the air, and the snow began to fall. I thought of the miles and miles of bleak country I had passed, then hurried on to seek shelter of the wood in front. Darker and darker grew the sky, and faster and heavier fell the snow, till the earth before and around me was glistening white carpet, the further edge of which was lost in the misty vagueness. The road was here and crude, and when on the level its boundaries were not so marked as when they passed through the cuttings. In a little while I found that I must have strayed from it, for I missed underfoot the hard surface, and my feet sank. It sank deeper into the moss and grass. Then the wind grew stronger and blew with an ever-increasing force, till I was forced to feign a run before it. The air became icy cold, and in spite of my exercise I began to suffer. The snow was now falling so thickly and whirling around me in such rapid eddies that I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every now and then the heavens were torn asunder by vivid lightning, and in the flashes I could see ahead of me a great mass of trees, chiefly yew and cypress, all heavily coated with snow. I was soon amongst the shelter of the trees, and there, in comparative silence, I could hear the rush of wind high overhead. Presently the blackness of the storm had become immerged into the darkness of the night. By and by the storm seemed to be passing away. It now only came in fierce puffs or blasts. At such moments the weird sound of the wolf appeared to be echoed by many similar sounds around me. Now and again through the black mass of drifting cloud came a straggling ray of moonlight, which lit up the expanse and showed me that I was on the edge of a dense mass of cypress and yew trees. As the snow had ceased to fall, I walked out from the shelter and began to investigate more closely. It appeared to me that amongst so many old foundations as I had passed, there might be still standing a house in which, though in ruins, I could find some sort of shelter for a while. As I skirted the edge of the copse, I found that a low wall encircled it, and following that I presently found an opening. Here the cypresses formed an alley leading up to a square mass of some kind of building. Just as I caught sight of this, however, the drifting clouds obscured the moon, and I passed up the path in darkness. The wind must have grown colder, for I felt myself shiver as I walked. But there was hope of shelter, and I groped my way blindly on it. Oh, that is fine, Papyrus. Go right on ahead. I stopped, for there was a sudden stillness. The storm had passed, and perhaps in sympathy with nature's silence, my heart seemed to cease to beat. But this was only momentarily, for suddenly the moonlight broke through the clouds, showing me that I was in a graveyard, and that the square object before me was a great massive tomb of marble, as white as the snow that lay on it. With the moonlight there came a fierce sigh of the storm, which appeared to resume its course with a long, low howl of many dogs or wolves. I was awed and shocked, and I felt the cold perceptibly grow upon me, till it seemed to have gripped me by the heart. Then, while the flood of moonlight still fell on the marble tomb, the storm gave further evidence of renewing, as though it were returning on its track, impelled by some sort of fascination. I approached the sepulchre to see what it was, and why such a thing stood alone in such a place. I walked around and read over the Doric door in German. Countess Döllingen of Graz, in Styria, sought and found death, 1801. On the top of the tomb, seemingly driven through the solid marble, for the structure was composed of a vast set of blocks of stone, was a great iron spike and stake. On going to the back, I saw graven in the great Russian letters, "The dead travel fast." There was something so weird and uncanny about the whole thing that it gave me a turn and made me feel quite faint. I began to wish for the first time that I had taken Johann's advice. Here a thought struck me, which came under almost mysterious circumstances and with terrible shock. This was Walpurgis Night. Walpurgis Night was when, according to the belief of millions, the devil was abroad, when the gates were opened and the dead came forth and walked, when all evil things of earth and air and water held revel. This very place the driver had specially shunned. This was the depopulated village of centuries ago. This was where the suicide lay, and this was the place where I was alone, unmanned, shivering with cold in the shroud of snow, with a wild storm gathering again upon me. It took all my philosophy, all the religion I had been taught, all of my courage, not to collapse in the paroxysm of fate. Of fright, my apologies. And now a perfect tornado burst upon me. The ground shook as though thousands of horses thundered across it, and this time the storm bore on its icy wings not snow, but great hailstones which drove with such violence that they might have come from the thongs of Balaric slingers, hailstones that beat down leaf and branch and made the shelter of the cypresses of no more avail than their stems were standing corn. At the first I had rushed to the nearest tree, but I soon feigned to leave it, and seek the only spot that seemed to afford refuge, the deep Doric doorway of the marble tomb. There, crunching against the massive bronze door, I gained a certain amount of protection from the beating of the hailstones, for now they only drove against me as they ricocheted from the ground on the side of the marble. As I leaned against the door, it moved slightly, and opened inwards. The shelter of even a tomb was welcome in that pitiless tempest, and I was about to enter it, when there came a flash of forked lightning that lit up the whole expanse of the heavens. In the instant, as I am a living man, I saw as my eyes turned into the darkness of a tomb, a beautiful woman, with rounded cheeks and red lips, seemingly sleeping on a bier. As the thunder broke overhead, I gasped, as by the hand of a giant, and hurled out into the storm. The whole thing was so sudden that before I realized the shock, moral as well as physical, I found the hailstones beating me down. At the same time, I had a strange dominating feeling that I was not alone. I looked towards the tomb. Just then there came another blinding flash, which seemed to strike the iron stake that surmounted the tomb, and to pour through to the earth, blasting and crumbling the marble as it burst into flame. The dead woman rose for a moment of agony while she was lapped in the flame, and a bitter scream of pain was drowned in a thunder crash. The last thing I heard was this mingling of dread sound, as again I was seized in the giant grasp and dragged away, while the hailstones beat on me. The air around seemed reverberant with the howling of wolves. The last sight that I remembered was a vague white moving mass, as if all the graves around me had sent out the phantoms of the sheeted dead, and that they were closing in on me through the white cloudiness of the driving hail. Gradually there came a sort of vague beginning of consciousness, then a sense of weariness that was dreadful. For a time I remembered nothing, but slowly my senses returned, my feet positively racked with pain, yet I could not move them. They seemed to be numb. There was an icy feeling at the back of my neck and all down my spine, and my ears, like my feet, were dead yet in torment. But there was in my breast a sense of warmth, which was by comparison delicious. It was a nightmare, a physical nightmare, if one may use such an expression, for some heavy weight on my chest made it difficult for me to breathe. This period of semi-lethargy seemed to remain a long time, and as it faded away I must have slept or swooned. Then came a sort of loathing, like the first stage of seasickness, and a wild desire to be free of something. I knew not what. A vast stillness enveloped me, as though all the world were asleep or dead, only broken by the low panting of some animal close to me. I felt a warm rasping at my throat that then came a consciousness of the awful truth which chilled me to the heart and sent the blood surging up through my brain. Some great animal was laying on me, and now licking my throat. I feared to stir, for some instinct of prudence bade me lay still, but the brute seemed to realize that there was now some change in me, for it raised its head. Through my eyelashes I saw above me the two great flaming eyes of a gigantic wolf. Its sharp white teeth gleamed in the gaping red mouth, and I could feel its hot breath fierce and acrid upon me. For another spell of time I remembered no more. Then I became conscious of how a low growl, followed by a yelp, renewed again and again. Then, seemingly very far away, I heard "Halloa! Halloa!" of many voices calling in unison. Cautiously I raised my head and looked in the direction whence the sound came, but the cemetery blocked my view. The wolf still continued to yelp in a strange way, and the red glare began to move around the grove of cypresses, as though following the sound. As the voices drew closer, the wolf yelped. Faster and louder. I feared to make either sound or motion. Nearer came the red glow over the white pallor which stretched into the darkness around me. Then, all at once, from behind the tree there came at a trot a troop of horsemen bearing torches. The wolf rose from my breast and made for the cemetery. I saw one of the horsemen, soldiers by their caps and their long military cloaks, raise his carbine and take aim. A companion knocked up his arm, and I heard the ball whiz over my head. He had evidently taken my body for that of the wolf. Another sighted the animal as it slunk away, and a shot followed. Then at a gallop the troop rode forward, some towards me, others toward the wolf as it disappeared amongst the snow-clad cypresses. As they drew nearer, I tried to move, but was powerless, although I could see and hear all that went on around me. 2 or 3 of the soldiers jumped from the horses and knelt beside me. One of them raised my head and placed his hand over my heart. "Good news, comrades," he cried. "His heart still beats." Then some brandy was poured down my throat. It put vigor in me, and I was able to open my eyes fully and look around. Lights and shadows were moving among the trees, and I heard men call to one another. They drew together, uttering frightened exclamations. The lights flashed as the others came pouring out of the cemetery pell-mell, like men possessed. When the further ones came close to us, those who were around me asked them eagerly, "Well, have you found him?" The reply rang out hurriedly, "No, no, come away, quick, quick. This is no place to stay in on this of all nights." What was it? Was the question asked in all manner of keys. The answer came variously and all indefinitely, as though the men were moved by some common impulse to speak, yet were restrained by some common fear from giving them thoughts. It indeed, gibbered one, whose wits had plainly given out for the innocent, or for the moment. "A wolf, and yet not a wolf," another put in, shuddering. "No use trying for him without the sacred bullet," a third remarked in a more ordinary manner. "Serve us right for coming out on this night. Truly we have earned our 1,000 marks," were the ejaculations of a fourth. "There was blood on the broken marble," another said with a pause. "The lightning never brought that there. And for him, is he safe? Look at his throat. See, comrades, the wolf has been lying on him, keeping his blood warm." The officer looked at my throat and replied, "He is all right. The skin is not pierced. What does it all mean? We should never have found him but for the yelping of the wolf." "And what became of it?" asked the man who was holding up my head, and who seemed the least panic-stricken of the party, for his hands were steady and without tremor. On his sleeve was the chevron of a petty officer. "It went home," answered the man, whose long face was pallid, and who actually shook with terror as he glanced around him fearfully. "There are graves enough there in which it may lay. Come, comrades, come quickly. Let us leave this cursed spot." The officer raised me to a sitting position as he uttered a word of command. Then several men placed me upon a horse. He sprang to the saddle behind me, took me in his arms, gave the word of advance, and turning our faces away from the cypresses, we rode away in a swift military order. As yet my tongue refused its office. I was perforce silenced. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I remember was finding myself standing up, supported by a soldier on each side. It was almost broad daylight, and to the north a red streak of sunlight was reflected into like a path of blood upon the waste of snow. The officer was telling the men to say nothing of what we had seen, except that we found an English stranger guarded by a large dog. "Dog? That was no dog," cut in the man who had exhibited such fear. "I think I know a wolf when I see it," the young officer answered calmly. "I said a dog." "Dog," reiterated the other ironically. It was evident that his courage was rising with the sun, and pointing to me, he said, "Look at his throat. Is that the work of a dog, master?" Instinctively I raised my hand to my throat, and as I touched it I cried out in pain. The men crowded round to look, some stooping down from their saddles, and again there came the calm voice of a young officer. "A dog, as I said. If aught else were said, we should only be laughed at." I was then mounted behind a trooper, and we rode on to the suburbs of Munich. Here we came across a stray carriage, into which I was lifted, and it was driven off to the Quarter Saisons. The young officer accompanied me, whilst a trooper followed with his horse, and the others rode off to the barracks. When we arrived, Herr Delbruck rushed so quickly down the steps to meet me that it was apparent he had been waiting within. Taking me by both hands, he solicitously led me in. The officer saluted me and was turning to withdraw when I recognized his purpose and insisted that he should come to my rooms. Over a glass of wine, I warmly thanked him and his brave comrade for saving me. He replied simply that he was more than glad, and that Herr Delbruck had at the first taken steps to make all the searching party pleased, at which ambiguous utterance of the maitre d'hotel smiled, while the officer pleaded duty and withdrew. But Herr Delbruck, I inquired, how and why was it that the soldiers searched for me? He shrugged his shoulders as if in depreciation of his own deed, as he replied, I was so fortunate as to obtain leave from the commander of the regiment in which I served to ask for volunteers. But how did you know I was lost? I asked. The driver came hither with the remains of his carriage, which had been upset when the horses ran away. But surely you would not send a search party of soldiers merely on this account? Oh no, he replied. But even before the coachman arrived, I had this telegram from the boyar whose guest you are. And he took from his pocket a telegram which he handed to me, and I read, Bistritz, be careful of my guest. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him, and ensure his safety. He is English, and therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow and wolves and night. Lose not a moment if you suspect harm to him. I answer your zeal with my fortune. Dracula. As I held the telegram in my hand, the room seemed to whirl around me, and if the attentive maitre d'hotel had not caught me, I think I should have fallen. There was something so strange in all this, something so weird and impossible to imagine, that there grew on me a sense of my being in some way the sport of opposite forces, the mere vague idea of which seemed to be, in a way, to paralyzing me. I was certainly under some form of mysterious protection. From a distant country had come, in the very nick of time, a message that took me out of danger of the snow sleep and the jaws of a wolf. I'm not sure about this Dracula fellow, though. As I've read many a time and seen in many of the human movies, he's not a good guy, is he? Oh, happy Halloween to you as well, Dragon Ninja Lord. Alright. And now on for something that'll surely chill you to the bones. This story is This New Old House by Bat Out of Hell 821. We bought an old house, my boyfriend and I. He's in charge of the new construction, converting the kitchen into the master bedroom, for instance, while I'm on wallpaper removal duty. The previous owner papered every wall and ceiling. Removing it is brutal but oddly satisfying. The best feeling is getting to a long peel similar to your skin when you're peeling from a sunburn. I don't know about you, but I kind of make a game of peeling, on the hunt for the longest piece before it rips. Under a corner section of paper, in every room, is a person's name and a date. Curiosity got the best of me one night when I googled one of the names, and discovered the person was actually a missing person. The missing date matching the date under the wallpaper. The next day I made a list of names and dates. Sure enough, each name was for a missing person with dates to match. We notified the police, who naturally sent out a crime scene team. I overheard one tick say, "Yup, it's human." Human? What's human? Ma'am, where is the material you removed from the walls already? This isn't wallpaper you were removing. The next story. I hate it when my brother Charlie goes away. By Horror in Pure Form. I hate it when my brother Charlie has to go away. My parents constantly try to explain to me how sick he is, that I am lucky for having a brain where all the chemicals flow properly in their destinations like undammed rivers. When I complain about how bored I am without a little brother to play with, they try to make me feel bad by pointing out that his boredom likely far surpasses mine, considering he's confined to a dark room in an institution. I always beg for them to give him one last chance. Of course they did at first. Charlie has been back home several times, each shorter in duration than the last. Every time, without fail, it all starts again. The neighborhood cats with gouged out eyes showing up in his toy chest. My dad's razors found dropped on a baby slide in the park across the street. Mom's vitamins replaced by a bit of dishwasher tablets. My parents are hesitant now, using last chances sparingly. They say his disorder makes him charming, makes it easy for him to fake normalcy, and to trick the doctors who care for him into thinking he is ready for rehabilitation. That I will just have to put up with my boredom if it means staying safe from him. I hate it when Charlie has to go away. It makes me have to pretend to be good until he is back. The next story is Guardians by Dark Alligator. He awoke to the huge insect-like creatures looming over his bed and screamed his lungs out. They hastily left the room and he stayed up all night shaking and wondering if it had been a dream. The next morning there was a tap on the door. Gathering his courage, he opened it to see one of them gently place a plate filled with fried breakfast on the floor, then retreat to a safe distance. Bewildered, he accepted the gift. The creatures chittered excitedly. This happened every day for weeks. At first he was worried they were fattening him up, but after a particularly greasy breakfast left him clutching his chest from heartburn, they were replaced with fresh fruit. As well as cooking, they poured hot steamy baths for him and even tucked him in when he went to bed. It was bizarre. One night he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by the insects. He was sickened, but disposed of the remains as best he could. He knew they had been protecting him. One morning the creatures wouldn't let him leave his room. He lay down, confused, but trusting as they ushered him back into bed. Whatever their motives, they weren't going to hurt him. Hours later, a burning pain spread throughout his body. It felt like his stomach was filled with razor wire. The insects chittered as he spasmed and moaned. It was only when he felt a terrible squirming beneath his skin that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him. They had been protecting their young. Scene read The First Day of School by Zenriel. Everyone loves the first day of school, right? New year, new classes, new friends. It's a day full of potential and hope before all the dreary depressions of reality show up to ruin all the fun. I like the first day of school for a different reason though. You see, I have a sort of power. When I look at people, I can sense a sort of aura around them, a coloured outline based on how long that person has to live. Most everyone I meet around my age is surrounded by a solid green hue, which means they have plenty of time left. A fair amount of them have a yellow-orangish tinge to their auras, which tends to mean a car crash or some other tragedy. Anything that takes people before their time, as they say. The real fun is when the auras venture into the red end of the spectrum, though. Every now and again, I'll see someone who's basically a walking stoplight. Those are the ones who get murdered or kill themselves. It's such a rush to see them and know their time is numbered. With that in mind, I always get to class very early so I can scout out my classmates' fates. The first kid who walked in was basically radiating red. I chuckled to myself. Too damn bad, bro. But as people kept walking in, they all had the same intense glow. I finally caught a glimpse of my own rose-tinted reflection in the window, but I was too stunned to move. A professor stepped in and locked the door. His aura was a sickening shade of green. And now for the last story in our tale. Oh, my apologies, there's the last two stories. My Daughter Learned to Count by Real Science 87. My daughter woke me around 11:50 last night. My wife and I picked her up from a friend Sally's birthday party, brought her home and put her to bed. My wife went into the bedroom to read while I fell asleep watching the Braves game. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging my shirt sleeve, "guess how old I'm going to be next month?" "I don't know, Beauty," I said as I slipped my glasses. "How old?" She smiled and held up 4 fingers. "It is 7:30 now. My wife and I have been up with her for almost 8 hours, and she still refuses to tell us where she got them." And then the final story for the night. There's no reason to be afraid by whoever fights monster. When my sister Betsy and I were kids, our family lived for a while in a charming old farmhouse. We loved exploring its dusty corners and climbing the apple tree in the backyard, but our favourite thing was the ghost. We called her Mother, because she seemed so kind and nurturing. Some mornings Betsy and I would wake up, and on each of our nightstands we'd find a cup that hadn't been there the night before. Mother had left it there, worried that we'd get thirsty during the night. She just wanted to take care of us. Among the house's original furnishings was an antique wooden chair, which we kept against the back wall of the living room. Whenever we were preoccupied watching TV or playing a game, Mother would inch that chair forward across the room towards us. Sometimes she'd manage to move it all the way to the center of the room. We always felt sad putting it back against the wall. Mother just wanted to be near us. Years later, after we'd moved out, I found an old newspaper article about the farmhouse's original occupant, a widow. She murdered her 2 children by giving them each a cup of poisoned milk before bed. Then she hanged herself. The article included a photo of the farmhouse's living room, with a woman's body hanging from the beam. Beneath her, knocked over, was that old wooden chair, placed exactly in the center of the room. And now I bid you all a good night. I hope that you all enjoyed these little creeps and tales. I do certainly hope that if you went out trick-or-treating that you went out safely, that your costumes were really well received, and that you brought back such bounds of candy that it was almost sickening. Enjoy the sweets, and I invite you to join me back next week for our last story time in honor of this month of Halloween. So remember, always treats, no tricks. If there's a glass of milk for you, don't drink it, for you don't know if Mother left it. And always be leery of the man in the sackcloth. Good night.